You're listening to The South Stands, a Buckeye football podcast by Ohio State fans for Ohio State fans on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and SoundCloud. Welcome back to The South Stands, everyone. From San Francisco, I'm your host, Zach Moore. Today is Wednesday, October 14th, and I am thrilled to have an audience with another very special guest. He is 1/3 of the excellent Ohio State coverage team at Cleveland.com, going into his second season on the Ohio State beat. His name is Nathan Baird, and you can hear Nathan 5 times a week on the Buckeye Talk podcast, along with our friends Doug Lesmerises and Stephen Means. You can also read Nathan's stuff at Cleveland.com/OSU, and we recommend you give him a follow on Twitter at NW Baird. That's NWBAIRD. Nathan, thanks so much for joining us. How are you today, my friend?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having us on, and thanks for pointing people to the work we do.
Excellent. Yeah, happy to do it. We're big fans of your work here. We reference it all the time. Nathan, before we get started, would you like to tell our listeners a little bit about the text service that Cleveland.com is providing to Ohio State fans?
Yeah, absolutely. So we call that Buckeye Talk as well. In fact, that predated the podcast, from what I'm told, or at least that's kind of, or maybe the podcast came first, but they called it Buckeye Talk because they wanted to link them. But it's 614-350-3315 if you send the text to that, or you can go online and there's another way to sign up. But if you just send a text to that, you'll get back a link to sign up to the service. And it's the first line of reporting that we do. So anytime there's breaking news, that's where that text goes out first before we start writing anything for the site, and certainly before we put it out on Twitter. It's going directly to your phone. Today, for instance, when we're doing interviews with Ohio State coaches and players, I'm texting updates straight from that to your phone. And it's not, we kind of gather them together. It's not like you're getting 40 texts, but you're getting the quick reporting of what they say, but then also our analysis on it, kind of telling you, here's what they said, but here's what it means. So that all of that stuff is, from a breaking news standpoint, that's our first line. In addition to that, things like analysis, when things happen, we tell you, kind of give you our take on it. That's an important part of that. Stephen Means pretty much daily is giving some kind of recruiting update from himself and the little team that we have together that follows recruiting stuff. Obviously, people who probably already know Doug Lesmerises, and who's been on this beat for a long time. He's a voice that's on the texts. And what am I forgetting? Oh, and then also just for the podcast, we use the text service as a way to interact with people. We'll do polls. We'll also sometimes just ask a question like, hey, who are you expecting to be the breakout player of this team? We kind of compile those together and make that sort of a podcast segment. It's a way for fans to have a voice on what is a really popular, widely listened to podcast on about Ohio State football. So it covers a lot of ground, and we think it's a really good value. It's a 2-week free trial. It's $3.99 a month after that. So basically $1 a week, and you get to be a part of all that. We had a live chat, or I should say a live podcast that we did last night, where people could, see us on video and jump in and interact and talk with us and answer questions and ask us questions. And we're also we're publishing a book right now. One of the big values right now is if you sign up for the 2-week free trial, we have an online book that's about the 2019 season and kind of what it means going forward. And there's, I think, 13 chapters. So if you sign up for the free trial, you can get the ones that have already published this week, and you can get all the other ones that will publish before the season. And you can get in and out with the free trial and get to read that book for free and decide if you like the free trial. And if not, it's easy to cancel and just text us stop. So a lot of value, I think, that gets packed into that $3.99, and we're really proud of that. And it's a big part of what we do.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I've been a subscriber from the start, and I can certainly vouch for all that. It's a great service. Just today, I got your updates from the Zoom call with safeties and special teams coach Matt Barnes, and there's some illuminating stuff that you revealed in those texts. I want to get into that a little bit later, but it's a great service for the cost of a cup of coffee a month. If you're a rabid Ohio State fan like me, I highly recommend this service. It's really great stuff. Before we jump into the good stuff, Nathan, I just have a couple of housekeeping items for our listeners I want to mention, and then we'll get going. We actually have a new website. You can visit at southstandsosu.com. We just launched it. You can listen to all of our podcast episodes there and check out our new blog. I've actually written a few pieces for the blog already. We have a new post from a special contributor, Matt Sloan, that's both really, really funny and thoughtful. I suggest you check that out. I'd also like to invite our listeners to head over to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the podcast. We'd greatly appreciate your feedback there. Finally, if you have any questions or feedback for us, you can send us an email at thesouthstandsosu@gmail.com. All right. Good stuff. So Nathan, I think probably because it's fresh in your mind, why don't we go ahead and start with the secondary, specifically the safeties, because I thought there was some interesting news coming out of the Zoom call that you were on today with safeties and special teams coach Matt Barnes. He sung the praises of both Josh Proctor and Marcus Hooker, who are battling for that deep safety spot. Now, Barnes also said Ohio State still plans to use that single high safety look. I believe he said, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Now, we've been under the assumption for months on this podcast that Josh Proctor would be the man at safety, but it sounds like we have a real battle at that position now. Do you have any insight into who might emerge from that competition, Proctor or Hooker?
So I think that had been the assumption, certainly coming out of last season, was that Josh Proctor, because he was the primary backup there, and also because of just some of the things that we've seen him do on a football field, that he was kind of the heir apparent. He was going to be the one that followed him behind Jordan Fuller and took over as that single high safety this year. And I asked the question today to Matt Barnes to clarify that they were going to stick with that single high look. And he said that will still be the base of the defense, because there had been speculation as far as how much more they might play in going back to a split safety situation. But we know Ryan Day likes that single high philosophy. And I assumed that that's what they would mostly move forward with this season.
Right.
But as recently as August, or as far back ago, I should say maybe as August, we had intel, and I think we talked about it on Buckeye Talk, through the text and on the pod, that Marcus Hooker had been working with the ones and was at least in that mix to be potentially the starter this season. And I thought, Matt Barnes didn't come out and say today who is starting. And it sometimes can be tricky to read tea leaves. Coaches say certain things for certain reasons and don't say certain things for certain reasons. However, from what we heard today, when you think about what Ohio State needs at that single high position, you need someone who is rangy. You need someone who is, I think you prioritize dependability over athleticism to some extent. You need someone who is really smart and can read back there and be kind of like the quarterback of the defense, the way they talk about Jordan Fuller being last season. Right. This whole week has been the coaching staff kind of raving about Jordan Fuller. If you've listened to some of the other calls too. And so today, when asked today, kind of what the difference is between those guys, to kind of compare and contrast Marcus Hooker and Josh Proctor, Matt Barnes, the first thing he said about Marcus Hooker was that he's more like a true center fielder, very rangy. What did he say? Kind of like something about his ball skills, like freakish ball skills. I mean,
like his brother.
Everything. Yeah. So everything he said today makes me think that on opening day, Marcus Hooker is the starting safety for Ohio State football, because of the way he describes him. That's what they need from that position. They need the center fielder. They need the guy back there who can line it all up and who they trust to kind of have that dependability sideline to sideline, the way that they did with Jordan Fuller last year. And I think that Josh Proctor is going to have a role. I think he's going to play with the first string defense at times, but I think it's going to maybe be more situational, because he talked about, him in kind of man-to-man situations or playing up near the line of scrimmage, playing up in the box. So maybe instead of last year where you had Pete Werner dropping back to sometimes be that safety when they had to pull the safety up for other things, I mean, maybe that's an area where down and distance situations, they look for to get Josh Proctor on the field in those situations, because they talked about, or Barnes talked about, there being times where they're going to put both of those safeties on the field together if the opposition's package and personnel dictate it. So that, I don't know if it's a huge surprise, but it's somewhat of a surprise. Maybe if you told somebody in January, I think that it would turn out this way, I think they would be surprised. I don't know that it surprises us who've been following the beat that much. Okay. that's happened today. It was just more of a confirmation of things that we had sort of seen and heard behind the scenes.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I found it, I guess I had missed that in the Buckeye Talk coverage, that Hooker was actually getting reps with the ones. And I had been banking actually quite a bit on Proctor kind of fulfilling that promise that we had seen at times last year. But very interesting development. I actually saw somebody on Twitter mention that perhaps Proctor would replace the Sam linebacker in certain situations. I think you've kind of hinted at that, where maybe he plays in the box. He has coverage responsibilities on maybe the tight end or a slot receiver. But yeah, where does that leave Proctor in the mix? I guess you've kind of already said it. He's going to be a situational player, it sounds like.
It sounds like it, although I will say that then cuts into how much you're putting someone like Baron Browning on the field.
Right.
Although, again, in those third down situations, we've thought that maybe he had more of a role in the rushman package, someone they could use as a stand-up rush end, the way they did at times last year. So, we've heard all this coach speak for the last few weeks, and you try to decide how much of it is coach speak and how much of it is real intel that they're giving out. Because like I said, sometimes they say things for us and sometimes they say things for the person they want to hear it. And it may or may not have truth to it in the way that we perceive truth to be. They're trying to get a message to somebody.
Got it.
And but if so, they've talked all along about how multiple they want this defense to be. I mean, Kerry Combs said that he's open to the concept of not just having different alignments on defense, but having kind of, personnel packages, the way that you do on offense. And that he thinks that defenses should adapt that and just become more unpredictable that way. And I think that makes a lot of sense, especially for a place like Ohio State with the talent that they're always going to have, just making yourself a little bit more unpredictable and sometimes being able to take advantage of that, trying to, don't be completely reactive, be maybe more proactive on the personnel you're putting on the field, make the offense adjust to that. There are obviously some limitations to that at certain positions maybe, but I think there's merit to it. So maybe that's actually playing out. Maybe now that's why you'll see, Baron Browning doesn't have as big of a role, or Josh Proctor doesn't have as big of a role, or someone else doesn't have as big of a role as you might have expected. But that doesn't mean they can't have still a pretty big impact, right? Because they're putting them in the one specific place that they could maybe maximize what they do.
Got it. Well, that makes a lot of sense. Well, while we're on the topic of the secondary, I wanted to get your take on what's happening at cornerback in fall camp. We know Sevyn Banks and Cam Brown are in the mix for the outside corner spot opposite Shaun Wade. There's been a lot of buzz about both Banks and Brown this offseason. We talked to Bill Landis of The Athletic back in July, and he was pretty bullish on both Banks and Brown. So they figured to both get a lot of playing time this season. Do you have any insight as to who might emerge there as the starter opposite Wade, Banks or Brown?
My assumption is it's going to be Banks, but I also think that it's going to revert kind of back to the way that starting cornerbacks were the first time Kerry Combs was here to some extent. I mean, Shaun Wade probably won't come off the field that much. I know Ryan Day said the other day that all of their starters, with the exception of Justin Fields, would probably come out a little bit. And he didn't mention the offensive line there. I think there's probably some exceptions there too.
Right.
But specifically said Shaun Wade's not going to play every snap as far as with the first string defense. And that may be true, but I would still expect him to play a lot there. But I think all along we've thought that there was a good chance that second cornerback slot, it may not be a 50-50 split, but that second cornerback slot might be some combination of Banks and Brown. So maybe it's like 60-40, something like that. Whoever starts, think of it almost in terms of what they did last year with Tuff Borland and Baron Browning at middle linebacker, where Tuff Borland was the starter, obviously, and he was the starter. But by the end of the season, those guys were playing, if not equal snaps, sometimes Baron Browning playing more snaps.
That's right.
Baron Browning playing maybe some of those more pivotal snaps at the end of a game. And especially in like big situations, they needed like his athleticism on the field. So I could see something like that emerging at this cornerback spot, where it's a spot that's largely shared with two guys, or maybe it's a 3-man rotation. Brown is the one who takes those snaps when Wade has to come out, or they decide to bring Wade out. Whatever, something along those lines. But I think I agree with Bill. I mean, we saw Sevyn Banks the first day. We didn't hardly get a look in the spring, as you know. I mean, we were supposed to have like several viewing opportunities in Ohio State. I don't know how they had been in the past, but it was refreshing to hear that we were going to get to see them that many times with our own eyes and kind of see that team develop in the spring. And obviously, cornerback was among the things that we needed to see the most, or wanted to see the most, so we could bring intel to the people out there like yourself and your listeners. And from the first day, I mean, Seven Banks just looked the part. I mean, he was just kind of physically just kind of exploding that day. Had a couple of picks in practice. Like, you couldn't have had like a better for a position that like wanted to probably show up and impress all these goofballs who are there to watch you and scrutinize you and evaluate you and go back and write flowery things about you. That was about as good a day as you could have had for a cornerback. And then we all went and did that. And Cam Brown didn't do anything amazing that day, and neither did Tyreek Johnson, or really not, maybe none of the other cornerbacks did. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that they weren't going to keep developing and have a fine spring. And then we didn't get to see them anymore. That was like the only practice we saw. So we didn't get to see other things develop behind the scenes, but just from what we've heard about how things are lining up in practice, the intel we've been able to drag out, Banks has still been working with the ones. I would expect him to be the starter opposite Wade to start the season, but I also think Brown's going to be pretty heavy in the mix there. Sounds like Marcus Williamson is the front runner at that slot corner spot. And I think that's really interesting because at the end of last season, that wasn't someone we were really talking about in speculation about that.
Right.
I think this happens at Ohio State a lot of times. Guys come in, and even when they're, pretty solid recruits in terms of their rankings and stuff, you get stuck behind so much other talent. And then these other big time prospects are coming in behind you. So after a while, you're like just another senior or junior who was a top 150 recruit or 200 or whatever, who hasn't had a chance to prove it. So people assume they kind of write you off. And he's someone that people have talked, favorably about as being a guy who's done some good things in practice. And maybe he can kind of emulate some of those Sean Wade-like qualities that worked so well for them in the slot last year.
I meant to ask you about Marcus Williamson. I'm glad you brought him up. He was a top 200 recruit in the 2017 class, so somebody that Kerry Combs actually recruited. He's a bit undersized, as I understand, about 5'9", if I'm not mistaken. I was also surprised to hear his name as the man emerging at that slot corner position. But it sounds like he's up to the task if he's emerged in a very competitive situation in fall camp. You mentioned him earlier, Tyreek Johnson. I wanted to ask you about him. Tyreek was a top 25 recruit in the 2018 class. I know he was dealing with an injury last season. He took a red shirt in 2018, but we've not heard much buzz about Johnson, which has been a little disappointing. Does he factor in the secondary at all this season, do you think?
I think just about everybody will, especially early on, because I believe them when they say they want to rotate bodies there the way that Kerry Combs did the first time.
Right.
Last season, obviously Combs wasn't there, but they were also in a situation where I think there was a pretty big gap between the three guys that they had and then what was below. You could put those three guys on the field and have them on for every single important snap of the season, Okudah, Arnett, and Wade. And why would you not do that? Well, This year, you've got Wade on one side. I don't know that we know yet exactly what the ceiling is for these other guys. So maybe that gets proven in time. Maybe they decide at some point, we just can't take Seven Banks off the field. We can't take Cam Brown off the field. We've got to find a way to get him more snaps, and that changes the rotation. But I would assume early in the season, you're going to see guys like Tyreek Johnson still get rotated through and get some snaps in with the rest of that first string defense. Whether that lasts, whether they can hold it, I think that remains to be seen. And I take them at their word that they're going to just base this on what is happening in practice. And sometimes I think that can be a good thing that happens. Maybe this coaching change is happening at an important juncture for Ohio State because you don't have a holdover. Hafley leaves, Combs comes back in, and not only is he giving fresh eyes to this stage of their career, but he's also the guy who recruited a lot of those guys. He can reach back and say, hey, I saw you when you were a senior and junior in high school. I saw what you were capable of. You're not doing it yet. Here's what you need to correct to get onto that trajectory. I still believe in you, that sort of thing, because sometimes I think players, when there's coaching changes, they feel like maybe they get written off. They don't get a fair shake from the new guy. I know Baron Browning talked about that last year, that the previous coaching staff, he just felt there was a disconnect. He wasn't playing his best football, and he had some culpability there too. But then, Al Washington comes in, and all of a sudden it kind of rejuvenated him. We saw him have a much more productive year last year.
Right.
And I think that could maybe happen a little bit with some of these cornerbacks if they're still willing, though, to put in the work. And it's a position where it all kind of comes down to discipline. Today, Matt Barnes was talking a lot about, in terms of Josh Proctor, talking a lot about consistency as still being the big factor for him. Like the ceiling is there. I mean, it's not a figment of people's imagination that he can make these big plays and these kind of highlight reel interceptions and the big hits. Like, all that stuff is real. It just doesn't, there's too many gaps in between. There's too many lapses. And I think that's probably what you need to see more of from the people at the level of Tyreek Johnson. I mean, it was nothing. It didn't mean something that he hadn't become a first string cornerback yet for this team. There was just too much talent ahead of him.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought it did mean something last year that he really was not even in that second level of the rotation. He was kind of on the outside of the depth chart in reality, the outside of the two deep. I think that's Ohio State doesn't need him to be Jeff Okudah next. I mean, obviously it'd be great for them if he were, but they don't need him to be Jeff Okudah this season. They just need him to be someone they can depend on in that second rung of the two deep. That's still where he kind of needs to prove himself first, and then it's building on that.
Yeah, with Johnson, I agree with you. I was a little concerned last year that he wasn't really in the mix anywhere close to the two deep, and there just didn't seem to be a lot of buzz around him. Over the years, observing, from afar, there are players that emerge as stars, but you hear about them earlier in their career before they're able to get on the field. You hear about what they're doing in practices. They're turning heads in practices. People are raving about them. Coaches and teammates are raving about them. And Johnson was one of those players that it just seemed there wasn't a lot of buzz around him when he arrived. But I'm glad to hear that he could get into the mix this year. And I think you make a really interesting point there about Combs being kind of a fresh start for him, a new set of eyes. And maybe that'll be kind of a rebirth for Johnson here going down the back half of his career. Why don't we move to the linebackers? Because there have been some interesting developments this offseason there. I was personally very surprised to hear the news that Pete Werner would be moving from the Sam to the Will. Now, when I think of weak side linebackers at Ohio State, I think freaky athleticism. I think preternatural instincts. I think ball hawking, playmaking ability. I think A.J. Hawk, Ryan Shazier, Jerome Baker. Now, I think Werner is a good, solid, probably undervalued player at the Sam. I certainly think he's got an NFL future. He seems like a really good athlete. But you correct me if I'm wrong here, Nathan. I just don't see the kind of athleticism or playmaking ability from Werner to be the kind of impact player Ohio State needs at the Will. And I understand, he had a different role with coverage responsibilities and so forth last year in the Sam, but I'm looking at 5.5 tackles for losses last year, 0 sacks. I don't know how many times they actually sent him after the quarterback. Probably not a lot, but no sacks, 2 fumble recoveries, no interceptions, though he was in coverage quite a bit. I don't know. Well, the other thing that you and Doug and Steven had talked about is that the Will is that position, that player that almost never leaves the field this season that looks to be Pete Werner. It appears that, he's going to be the man, he's going to be the anchor of that linebacker core. I worry some folks maybe are getting a little over their skis with Werner. Maybe he's being miscast. Maybe a little too much is being asked of him in that role. Nathan, what are your thoughts on Werner's move to the Will?
Similar to what you're seeing with Marcus Hooker, I think this comes down to, in a lot of ways, just the dependability that they see in Pete Werner. And because they feel like when they look at those linebackers, who's the one that they can't afford to take off the field? I think it's Pete Werner.
Yeah.
I think, they know what they have with Tuff Borland, and they did it last season. There's guys that you can sub in for him in certain scenarios. Certainly in like nickel packages, he was a guy that was coming off the field and you were using 2 different linebackers there, usually Harrison and Browning, or Harrison and I guess Werner sometimes, some combination of that. I agree with you that at first glance, it didn't necessarily it wasn't our obvious choice. I mean, we didn't come out of last season thinking, well, in this coming fall, they're obviously going to move Werner inside. That wasn't really what we were thinking. The way they describe it, though, it does start to make more sense to me. I agree that he doesn't, at first glance, compare athletically, dynamically to those guys that you mentioned. I will say, though, that just, I guess, in terms of reliability, in terms of having the guy that you feel like you can't take off the field, the guy who I think also has enough football instinct, kind of football IQ, that he can adapt at that position. I think that's also the other thing to remember. You're not making this choice in a vacuum. You're making it relative to the other options that you have to put there.
Right.
So if you're not going to move Pete Werner there, that means you were either going to move Baron Browning in there, which is what we actually thought might happen first. But I think it gets back to kind of just like, do they want him in a position where he's having to make those reads, or do they want him in a position where maybe he can be more reactive and just sort of more freedom of movement? I think they can get that out of him at the Sam. I think from what he's proven, what he's shown in 3 years, I think they think that's the better fit for him. Okay. So then are you moving one of those juniors up and putting them at the Will to where it's, Taraja Mitchell, Kayvon Pope, Dallas Gant, one of those guys, does he fit better at the will? And if so, are you keeping him on the field at all times instead of someone like Pete Werner, who's losing snaps that way? I don't think that math necessarily added up to them. So it's looking at that whole group and saying, who's the one guy that we feel like is the Malik Harrison in terms of not necessarily the kind of football player they are, but just in terms of we can't take him off the field. That's where I think that Werner decision was made. We'll see if that costs them somewhere along the line. But I agree with you, though, that I think Pete Werner was a little bit underrated.
Right.
The whole linebacker crew, I mean, obviously I started coming into last season. So I had a vague perspective on 2018 from someone who just followed football from a wider perspective in the Big Ten and who was there for the Purdue Ohio State game, obviously. And so I knew that linebacker had been a situation, but I guess I didn't until I got here and started reporting on this team and hearing from fans. I didn't realize just how much of a sense of kind of dread or that's not the right word, but just like how big of a concern there was about that group and about turning that group around and getting it headed in the right direction, about it potentially being this big kind of crater in the middle of the defense. And that obviously wasn't the case last year. I think they all asserted themselves really well. Borland was healthy and had kind of his bounce back year. Malik Harrison was one of the most underrated players in the Big Ten.
He was good.
And Werner's right in that list behind him. But again, because of the way the Sam linebackers used at Ohio State, it's an outside linebacker spot. A lot of times you're just following the tight end around. We saw last year those few times where he's actually dropping back into deeper coverage. So there wasn't really a position to pile up a bunch of stats,
right.
And especially from like a pass rushing standpoint, there wasn't really the opportunity for that. I'm actually kind of intrigued by what happens now if you start to use him more like that. If you put him where Malik Harrison was and then ask him to do Malik Harrison things, what does Pete Werner's football skills allow him to do in that position? It may not be exactly what Malik Harrison did, but it may not. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be something less. It could just be something different.
Interesting. Okay. Well, he certainly has great size and enough athleticism to be an effective player there. And I guess we'll see just how good he can be. I'm curious now what this means for Baron Browning. You mentioned moving him to the Sam. Is he going to have coverage responsibilities now? I mean, personally, I think that's kind of a waste of Browning's talents. I think he's got a niche as a pass rusher. We saw it last year. He can really get after the quarterback. I'm wondering if maybe somebody else comes in passing situations. We mentioned it earlier. Maybe that player is Proctor and he kind of plays the role of the Sam, and Browning is then moved into a pass rushing position there. But I would certainly hate for him to be kind of a bit like Warner's role last year, where he's really out in coverage a lot and really not around the line of scrimmage making plays or getting into the backfield. What do you think this means for Browning?
I agree with you that just the idea of him following Pat Freiermuth and other tight ends around the field as like an escort doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And I also don't know that that's the best skill set matchup for him either. So I share those concerns. I wrote about this for the site earlier this week, and I don't know if it was some of my best analysis because I still feel like I agree with you that I think Baron Browning needs to be playing downhill in some way. Yeah. He needs to be just his physicality, his athleticism, getting to the ball. I think those are important, and being a force in the box up front, I still think is something that needs to be a big part of his game. He says he wants to be outside. He says that that's where he's most comfortable. But I think that plays as much to the concept of using him as a pass rusher as anything else. I don't think it's necessarily that he's super excited about being out there covering tight ends and stuff. So what I wrote was essentially, and I do believe this, that if he's willing to embrace a more specialized role, and if Ohio State buys into just using him in that specialized role, that maybe could be where you could get a big impact out of him. We saw last year as a pass rusher what he was able to do. Now, again, I will caution people, you can go back and look at the 5 sacks he had. Either 3 or 4 of them came when he was lined up as an edge rusher next to Chase Young.
That's right.
So Chase Young is, I don't know. I might have been able to, I'm pretty old and slow and fat, but I might have been able to get a sack last year if I'm lining up next to Chase Young and nobody's blocking me. I mean,
right.
Certainly nobody would block me if they saw me on a football field. So I'm being hyperbolic, but with Baron, it definitely was a factor in why Baron Browning was able to get those sacks. He's not going to be lining up next to Chase Young this year. He's going to have to maybe get those a little bit more on his own. Doesn't mean he still can't be an effective weapon that way. So I think it's just a matter of if they're going to buy into this, it's got to come from both sides. It's got to be the coaching staff saying, not really dabbling with this, saying like, listen, we've evaluated everyone. We are going with situationally the best athlete for all 11 spots, and here's who they are, and that's the end of the story. We're not playing games with this. If they move forward with that, and then you have a room full of guys, the tougher part is getting a room full of guys who buy into that. You got guys like Baron Browning, who this is their last year of college football, and they're supposed to be in the NFL next year. They want to make that impact to show that their show teams are worthy of that. Mm-hmm. He's not the only person in that category. You've got a whole group of juniors that are like really anxious, eager for their opportunity, but they've also got to prove that they're worthy of it. So there would seem to be some really good competition in that linebacker room still, and I think it makes sense that they're going to try to move guys around, but would it also not shock me at the end of the day if you still basically just saw 3 starters carry this team through the season? That probably wouldn't shock me either. I think it should happen organically, and it should happen whatever plays out on the field. We shouldn't forget about Justin Hilliard, I suppose, as another option at that Sam spot. I'm just hesitant that they're going to give that spot to him. I will say, they used him last year, but it was exclusively really just against Wisconsin that he was a starting level player in those 4 linebacker looks that they gave Wisconsin. So does that mean that they trust him enough that he could be an early down a Sam linebacker, and then you switch to someone else that's maybe a little bit more athletically dynamic in that next later downs or whatever, or you move to Browning for those pass rush situations? I mean, you could end up having like 3 guys sharing that Sam spot, I suppose. I just wonder how much that leaves you exposed in other ways, because there's obviously a reason why they weren't trusting him more in other scenarios. So we'll see. Some of this is because we haven't seen him in the spring, and we've had very limited access to the team at all, obviously, in the fall. We're kind of speculating and basing on just like little tidbits we're hearing here and there, but we'll know a lot more once they actually line up on October 24th. It's going to be kind of interesting just to see the warm-ups on October 24th, let alone to actually see this team then go out and play, the first few series of football to see where guys actually are lining up.
Yeah. And I wonder if it's something that these competitions at linebacker might linger into the season just a little bit. I personally have been writing this for our site and also talking about on our podcast. I really feel like the linebackers need to find another level this year. I'm hoping that someone like Werner and Tough Borland, Browning, the guys that they've been leaning on so far, have another gear that they can find, because I do think they were able to get through a Big Ten schedule last year. I certainly believe they'll be able to get through a truncated Big Ten schedule that doesn't present a lot of hurdles during the regular season. Where I worry, though, is the postseason. And let me ask you this. If you're Dabo Swinney, how are you feeling about Travis Etienne against the Ohio State linebackers? If you're Nick Saban, how are you feeling about the matchup of Najee Harris against the Ohio State linebackers? I would think both of those coaches maybe are feeling pretty good about those matchups. What do you think?
Well, I mean, this is the season to me for Ohio State. It's answering questions like that on defense, right? Because Dabo Swinney knows how Travis Etienne matched up against Ohio State. He matched up really well last year. Yeah, that's how they won that game. And that was when Clemson still had to worry about Chase Young and Jeff Okudah and Damon Arnett and those 3 fifth-year senior tackles, and all those guys are gone. So now you've got a defense that, that pass rush last year and just Chase Young alone, and then Jeff Okudah taking half the field. I mean, that cleans up a lot of other problems, or it minimizes those problems. Does. And now those things can much more easily get exposed because you've got players of that caliber who are no longer on the field. I've been pretty bearish about the Ohio State defense. I still think they have a chance to win the national championship. That's who I think will win the national championship when I had to compare them and Clemson head to head. But there's enough concern there for me at really every level of the defense. And linebacker is almost the one that I'm the least concerned about. And maybe just because we know those guys so well, they've been around for so long, that there's a steadiness that they can get to. But we've already talked about the cornerbacks, and then look at what's happening right now personnel-wise at the 3 technique and just really the defensive tackle depth overall.
Let's move to that, actually. That was going to be my next question. I share your concerns. Why don't you go ahead and talk about what's happening there at defensive tackle?
Well, I mean, coming out of last season, it actually looked like it should have been a potential strength of this team. We didn't, I've never seen Tron Vincent play football because I got here, like you said, before last season. He did not play a snap of football last year. But you can just look at his background and what he brings to the table athletically. I know that they're excited about what he could be as a college football player. And you had Haskell Garrett in front of him as maybe a guy with more experience, one of those players who probably got overlooked a little bit last year because they don't play a lot of snaps, but that was because there was such a glut of talent ahead of him. But I think he had the respect of the people on this team that he could handle this a Big Ten role. So those two guys, you thought, all right, well, that you're going pretty deep at defensive tackle at 3 technique right there. Well, we don't know if either of those guys are healthy to start the year. Obviously, people know about what happened with Haskell Garrett in this incident where he suffered a gunshot wound. And we know he's been back at practice, but as of last week was not a full participant. They didn't know if he was going to be ready for the season opener. And Tron Vincent was not at the portion of practice that we were allowed to see a couple weeks ago. I guess that was October 3rd or so that we saw that practice. We were told that he was there, just wasn't at the portion we saw, which I don't know what to make of that necessarily. But it seems like there may also be some limitations there because Larry Johnson said the other day, I guess it was last week, we talked to him, that he wasn't committing to him being ready either for the start of the season.
Right.
So all of a sudden you've got a lot of questions in the middle of this defense. And next to that, you've got Tommy Togiai and you've got Antoine Jackson. And that's another guy who's been sort of around and you think has this potential, but maybe just hasn't had the full opportunity to show it. And now he's going to be a guy that they depend on in a big way right away. So when I talk about these concerns, I've had some blowback from our readers and listeners when I point out all these concerns, because it sounds like I'm saying this defense is going to be trash or that's going to fall back to like the 2018 level. And I don't think that's the case. I think they're going to be better than that. But is this a national championship defense? I think that's a fair question to ask. The offense may be so good that it doesn't matter, but I think there are enough positions. If we were only talking about 3 technique, that would be one thing. But if you're talking about 3 technique and are the linebackers hitting their ceiling or can they be better? And 2 of your 3 cornerback spots, how good are they? And you've got a new starter at safety, and it isn't going to be the starter everyone was expecting to kind of take that job and run with it. Now it's going to be the lower ranked prospect who's kind of working his way up there. So like enough of those things pile up that you start to, I think it becomes a real question.
Yeah.
So it's not me saying that they can't be that. It's me saying, will they be that? And we have to just kind of watch it unfold over the course of the season.
I'm with you. I've been uneasy about the Ohio State defense, a little uneasy. I don't want to exaggerate. I don't want to go too far because there is talent there and they've recruited well. And there's good reason to trust the player development track record of guys like Larry Johnson and Kerry Combs. But I share your concerns now with the developments at defensive tackle. One thing I had said this offseason, I personally believe, I know there's this sentiment among many of the experts that Ohio State doesn't have to be great on defense. They just have to be good enough because of what the offense is going to bring to the table. I'm not sure I agree with that sentiment because, again, I'm looking at this team through the lens of can they beat Alabama and Clemson in back-to-back playoff games? That to me is really the measuring stick. We know that what they have is more than likely good enough to get them through a Big Ten schedule. But is the defense going to be good enough to get through an Alabama and a Clemson? And I'm looking at Tron Vincent. I'm with you. And I remember his dad. His dad was a star defensive back at Wisconsin back in the day, a 5-time Pro Bowler with the Philadelphia Eagles. I was very excited when Vincent came to Columbus. He was the number 1 defensive tackle prospect in the 2018 class, a top 20 player. So I was very disappointed to hear that he's not quite ready to come back yet. And I really thought that Vincent's emergence as an impact player on this defense was one of the keys to this defense getting back to greatness in 2020. And it looks like we're going to have to wait a little bit there. Now I'm getting a little concerned though with Penn State looming there in week 2. You've got the lack of depth there inside at the defensive tackle spots. Again, the questions we've just discussed about linebacker ceiling and some of the new faces in the secondary. And you're facing a pretty darn good team in Penn State in week 2 on the road. I don't know. I'm pumping the brakes a little bit right now on greatest Ohio State team in history. I think that's what you guys talked about yesterday on the Zoom call with fans on the podcast. Was that the question, whether Ohio State could have the most special season in program history?
Yeah, could this be the greatest season in Ohio State football history? And
Yeah,
there were a lot of semantic arguments about difference between greatest season and greatest team. So people can go listen to that podcast and kind of see how
it's a good one.
we broke that down. That it's not necessarily is this the greatest collection of talent. Could it be the greatest season? And we talked about what that could mean.
Got it. Okay. So real quick, then, you've already mentioned one of the players that could be stepping in here. That's Antoine Jackson. Correct me if I'm wrong about this. He was actually an Auburn recruit back in 2016, top 50 recruit. Things didn't work out for him at Auburn. He went to junior college, then came to Ohio State in 2018, was one of the top defensive tackle prospects out of junior college, coming to Ohio State. So he's got the pedigree, right? He's got the credentials to be a very good defensive tackle here. Who else do you think might emerge? Would they bring a defensive end, someone from the defensive end rotation, into the middle as kind of a stopgap solution? Who are the next men up?
So I think early on, if Vincent and Garrett are both unavailable, I think you will see someone like a Tyler Friday maybe slide over and play some of that three technique position. I mean, it's the reverse of what we saw last year when they had depth at defensive end, but had some injuries to start the year. Cooper, it was either Smith or Friday, I think, was out to start the season. So they took Jayshon Cornell and slid him back out to defensive end where he had started his career because they had more depth at defensive tackle. That was really just a one-game thing because then they got a little bit more healthy at end. I think you could maybe see the opposite of that. I think you could say they have so much depth at defensive end that they could maybe slide Vincent or slide Tyler Friday in, at least in some. And he all but admitted that's going to happen. Like he wouldn't give up the goods when we talked to him last week, but basically said, yeah, we're working on some stuff. We'll see what happens. I think Larry Johnson had hinted at it too. Didn't deny that was in the mix. So is it going to be a early down thing? Probably not. I like if I had to guess right now, if those guys aren't healthy, I think you're starting Tommy Togiai and maybe Antoine Jackson next to him as the first string defensive line against Nebraska. But then where they go depth wise after that, it gets thin fast. I think, at least in terms of like proven experience. I mean, they've talked about some other really young guys, or you've got someone like John Cage, I guess, that's another one of those guys that's just been around for a while, but has never really been in a spot that mattered, for lack of a better term.
Right.
And now they'd be asking him. It's just one of those guys that they're more and more, they seem to be asking guys who've always been these deep background guys to like step up and be maybe, if not front row guys, then that next row behind, and maybe we over analyze that, and because that happens a lot. I mean, that happens at every program, and at Ohio State at least you have the luxury of those guys back there being players who would be starting for a lot of other programs. But again, by the standard that you're setting, and I think the standard that we should all be analyzing this program by, it's not about the team that you need to beat Rutgers or even Michigan State or even Michigan in some ways. It's the roster you need, the starting lineup you need to beat Alabama and Clemson. Yeah. And so that's where I think this defense does still have a little bit of something to prove. I think last year they came in with a chip on their shoulder, and it was a lot of those guys who were coming back from the year before when they had been pretty bad at times. And that's why that chip was on their shoulder. This year, and maybe last year it was more of something in their mind and it was a media and fan creation. Well, this year, I mean, it's not that they should have a chip on their shoulder. It's just guys who have to prove that they belong as front row Big Ten players, and they've never been in that spot before. Until they do it, it's fair to ask, is that guy ready?
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. Yeah, boy, it worries me a little bit that they might have to lean on some really young guys at defensive tackle, at least for a few weeks, because it's really, that is one position where you really need a few years and some time in the weight room, putting on weight and strength. So we'll see how that develops. Nathan, I'm mindful of your time. I know we're running out of time, and I want to get your thoughts on some of the things happening on the other side of the ball, and maybe we can go kind of rapid fire real quick here, and then I'll get you out of here. The Ohio State running backs, it looks like all signs might be pointing to a 50-50 split between Master Teague and Trey Sermon. How do you see the running game in 2020?
Yeah, it really does seem like some kind of a timeshare, and that's sort of what I thought would happen all along. I don't know that it'll be a 50-50 split. I think it could be situational, maybe a hot hand kind of thing. Somebody else, one of those two guys, the matchup fits him better that day, so he gets the ball more, or is just being more productive for whatever reason that game.
Okay.
And, Tony Alford talked about them being, at least the goal is that everybody is an all-around back and can thrive in any situation, but I think that's not realistic necessarily. I think these guys do have some differences, and whether that's physically, whether that's athletically. It's not that necessarily one is better than the other. It's just that they're different kinds of players. And I think you're going to see that maybe a little bit in the way that they're used and in the situations where one might thrive and the other one might be just adequate or whatever. So I think it creates some interesting options, I think, for Ohio State. Ryan Day even said on a call that we had with him Tuesday that there's scenarios where they might put two running backs on the field together. And I think that's interesting. I think Ohio State, like, I don't know. Maybe this is just too much being from the era of the video game era or whatever, but I feel like they should just be more experimental. I mean, just put more things out there and keep the opponent guessing. You can't just be completely wild with it. I think you have to know what your identity is. You have to know who you are and play to your strengths. But if you have two guys that are essentially that same level and you've got an offensive line as talented as this one in front of them, I think having two guys there, if you can put them both on the field and keep the opponent guessing. And then on top of that, you've got a quarterback that can run the ball the way that Justin Fields can. That means you're taking somebody else off the field, obviously, when you're putting the two running backs back there. So you're either going without a tight end or you're going with one less receiver. So you're giving up something, but I think if it just gives them more options. I'm curious and eager to kind of see how they decide to use that. But I think it's a good thing for this program. After that first day of spring practice, or I guess I should say the second day, when we found out how severe the Master Teague injury was. And Trey Sermon was not yet a part of this program. And Marcus Crowley obviously is not back to full health from where he was after tearing the ACL last year. I mean, look at where this program was in terms of its running back position. I mean, it was kind of no offense to Steel Chambers and Mayan Williams, but it was a big problem. Yeah. Like a big problem. Right. That was not a national championship level running back situation. And I'm not saying that these guys are going to be J.K. Dobbins, but now to have Trey Sermon in the program and healthy and have Master Teague way ahead of schedule in terms of his health. That's two options now that I think behind this offensive line and in conjunction with Justin Fields gives you the kind of running threat that you're going to need to keep defenses honest.
I'm really interested to see what Sermon can do in a balanced offense with a great offensive line, as you've mentioned it. In hindsight, Sermon was probably not the best fit for those quarterback-focused, pass-happy offenses at Oklahoma. I mean, those offenses relied heavily on the quarterback for production in the run game. If you look at 2018, Kyler Murray ran for 1,000 yards. Last year, Jalen Hurts led Oklahoma both in rushing and rushing attempts. And on top of that, Oklahoma always seems to take a two-back approach to the run game anyway. That was the case going all the way back to Bob Stoops. So any running back in that system is almost always sharing carries with both a quarterback and a second running back. Well, Sermon may have more opportunities in this offense, and I'm anxious to see what he can do. You mentioned Justin Fields in the run game. In your opinion, given what happened last year with the knee injury and the impact that it had later in the season, especially in that Clemson game, how much should they be using him?
We've had a lot of discussion about this on the site, or on the podcast, I should say. And I don't know that I don't know if I change a lot from the way they used him last season. I think it's never going to be, I don't think, like a Cam Newton kind of situation, or even an Oklahoma's kind of situation, where your quarterback is it's a very quote unquote college offense where the quarterback is this being unto himself that kind of just is the focus of the whole offense, and either he's throwing it or running it, and that's the primary option. I don't see that path for Justin Fields. I think he's just too dangerous of a weapon as a passer, both in terms of his arm and his mind and everything he can do out there. And you have too many other legitimate receiving weapons to use. So I still see it being more like what he did last year. Now, will they? I could see a situation though where they turn to him even more around the goal line. Like if you think he is the most trustworthy option over even these two other guys you have, Sermon and Teague, and he's the guy that can get the ball in the end zone the most. I mean, I could see a situation where his rushing touchdowns increase this year. I think he had 10 last year. So, I mean, averaging, one every game and a half or whatever. So, I mean, I think that could go up. I just don't know that I see them like completely cutting him loose and just letting him run wild. But because of all the things you can do with him in the passing offense, and also because if there is no Justin Fields on the field, and they did run into an injury situation with him late last season, can you win a national championship with the other quarterbacks they have on this roster?
No, I agree with you. I think they need to protect him a little bit.
You can't put him in a bubble. You can't wrap him in plastic, but you do have to be smart with how much you just turn him loose. And I think there is a diminishing level of returns when you start running him a lot on his own, when you have so much other talent that can take that ball.
That makes total sense, and I'm in total agreement with you there. Well, let's shift over to the receivers and the passing game here real quickly. I've been reading that Jamison Williams has emerged as the third starter along with Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson. I'm wondering if you're hearing the same thing. Now, we know that Wilson is moving to the slot, and then Jamison and Olave would then be your X and Y, or some combination, vice versa. I can never tell who should be the X or Y. It's always been a little confusing for me. But it sounds like Jamison Williams has emerged. That's a bit of a surprise to me. Is that what you've been hearing?
Yeah, I mean, he's certainly in the mix for that. And it's one of those things too, though, if they decide to rotate 6 guys, then starter it doesn't mean nothing, but it also doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get any more snaps than the guy right behind you, right, whoever they rotate in behind him. I will say the big question is how much are these freshmen going to contribute right away? And that's early on, once this COVID stuff started happening, we could sort of see this shift starting to develop, where James Williams, just because of the experience he had, was maybe going to have a leg up on some of these freshmen coming in. It's not that Jameson Williams isn't talented in his own right. He's another example of sometimes one of those guys that, pretty highly ranked guy, a lot of talent, comes in, and then they have so much receiving talent flooding in over this class and the next one, that he gets forgotten a little bit. And then you have Garrett Wilson kind of running off and hiding as a freshman and breaking out in a way that Jameson Williams didn't. So I think that's where he also got forgotten a little bit too. So it doesn't surprise me at all that he's in a position to have a potentially big season as a freshman or as a sophomore here. Now, how does that rotation shift over the course of a year as these freshmen get more reps in full pads, at full speed, full contact, things that they're still, I think, kind of progressing through as a team? When Brian Hartline and Ryan Day talk about this offense, that's one of the things they keep bringing up, is they know the talent's there with these young guys, but you don't know necessarily what's there until they get smacked in the mouth a little bit. And it's happened a little bit. They've had some of those practices, but I don't think they've had as many yet to get the full assessment that they want. So once we know more about those guys, it's possible that you could see some of these rotations shift as far as who's starting and who's not. You saw that over the course of last year too. Garrett Wilson, by the end of the season, had a much bigger role in this offense than he did for the season opener.
That makes sense. So it sounds like Jamison Williams, he's kind of a placeholder right now at one of those starting spots, and we might expect that some of these younger ballyhooed freshmen, Julian Fleming, Jackson Smith, and Jigma, might move into that role and take more of that playing time over the course of the season.
I don't know if I'd say placeholder, though. I mean, because I could see there's also a scenario where he just is better than them this whole season. He's got a year of experience. And like I say, he's a talented receiver in his own right. I mean, he may just be the best guy that needs to be on the field more. I'm just saying that in terms of how much they rotate guys, we also kind of theorize, like, do you want a scenario where your first string is Olave, Wilson, and Williams, and then your second string is 3 true freshmen, and that's how you're doing the rotation? And so then that second rotation just brings in 3 true freshmen, because it could be Jackson Smith and Jigba at the slot and Fleming and G. Scott on the outside.
Right?
Is that what you really want? Like, do you need more of a veteran on that second string? We don't know that yet. We haven't gotten a complete read on their line of thinking. I think they're probably going to just say, well, whoever earns it, and we'll figure it out. But I could see that as being a reason why they'd mix it up too. At the end of the day, when you're going to rotate those 3 spots that much, I don't know that it matters all that much which one is starting. It means something that you're on there for the first, the first series of the game. I'm not going to dismiss it. It means nothing. But if you're switching them out every time, it means less.
Got it. Okay, real quick, then I'm going to get you out of here. Nathan, I know you're an AP poll voter, and I wanted to get your thoughts real quick of what we've seen around the rest of the country so far. We got a big game coming up this weekend, Alabama, Georgia. I thought Georgia looked very impressive last week against Tennessee. Clemson looked very impressive in their game against Miami. To me, those 2 programs really stood out. Georgia, it looks like they're getting more than competent quarterback play. To me, they look like a legitimate playoff contender at this stage. I wanted to ask you, though, about Alabama's performance against Ole Miss. They gave up a lot of yards, 647 yards, a total offense, 48 points. Did that change your view of Alabama at all? And then would you say this is now a 4-team playoff race with the emergence of Georgia?
So it didn't change my view of Alabama that much. It did. I guess it didn't make me think that they are something less necessarily. How do I want to say this? I think there were some circumstances of that game that may have been a little bit unique. I'm not excusing that performance. It was a pretty horrendous defensive performance, and one that you can't afford to have week to week in the SEC. I mean, it's going to get them beat, and they're not going to be a playoff team. But you're playing against one of your former assistants. There were definitely been some talk out there as far as whether Lane Kiffin had some intel as far as signals and signs and things like that, and if that was a factor in that game. Again, I'm not making excuses for Alabama. They have to be better. I do have, I think, a growing more favorable impression of Georgia, though. Mm-hmm. And I really am intrigued by this matchup because you have a team that, I mean, Georgia may be the best defense in the country, at least as far as the ones who've actually played football games so far. Maybe Ohio State and somebody else will have something to say about that eventually. But the ones who've actually been out there right now playing at the high level, they might be as good as anybody. And now to put that up against the firepower that Alabama has, because, there are people out there who, when they hear me talk about Ohio State, say, well, what does it matter if their defense isn't all that good? Because they're just going to be amazing on offense. Well, go look at what Alabama's doing on offense right now. I mean, Mac Jones has been sensational.
Yeah. Scary.
Najee Harris in the backfield is just crushing people. They've got multiple great receivers. It's what they can do on offense is really outlandish. So having those two forces kind of go head to head is going to be a lot of fun to watch. I do think we had just we do a thing called Mark It Down Monday every week on the pod, and we had kind of redone our season predictions because so much had changed from the first time we did it. And we all picked Ohio State, Clemson, Alabama, and then Florida as our fourth playoff team. And then Florida immediately goes out and loses. So I think Georgia would probably take my spot there. The tricky thing, though, is that Alabama and Georgia play this week, and then they play again in the SEC championship game, presumably,
right?
If Georgia takes care of its business against the rest of the SEC East. So those teams, either one of them beats the other one twice, or they split. If one of them beats the other one twice, it kind of knocks them out of playoff contention. Yeah. And if they split, and we've never seen a team lose the conference championship game and still make the playoff. I think it would have happened last year. If Ohio State had gone on and lost that game to Wisconsin, I think they still probably would have just dropped to fourth, but still made the playoff because Georgia was the fifth team and they had two losses. Right. So I think it would have happened. There's other years where it probably would have happened if the number 1 or 2 overall seed had lost in the conference championship game, but it hasn't actually happened yet. So that'll be an interesting thing to see. If Alabama, for instance, wins this game and then is the 1 or 2 seed, and then Georgia beats them for the SEC championship, maybe that gets both of those teams in the playoff. Mm-hmm. But certainly a situation where they beat each other twice, one of them isn't getting in. And even if it's a split, I don't know we can guarantee that they're both getting in. So I think that fourth spot is very much still wide open. But I think those first three, I would expect still Ohio State, Clemson, and Alabama. Just disregarding what we saw from Alabama last week, I still think there's just so much offensive talent on that team. I think they find their way into one of those 4 spots. Yeah,
I would agree with that. Well, Nathan Baird, Cleveland.com. As my shrink likes to say, our time is up. Thanks so much for joining us.
This was very therapeutic.
Very therapeutic. Excellent. Thanks so much, Nathan. Have a great day, and we'll chat again with you soon.
Great. Thanks a lot.
You've been listening to the South Stands, a Buckeye football podcast. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and visit our website at southstandsosu.com.